I'm your host, Doreen Steenland, and today I'd like to welcome our guest, Susan Peirce Thompson. So I'm aware that you have a way of living that's really well tailored to maintaining health and flourishing in the midst of a full life. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to this place of balance, which is what we're all looking for, right?
Oh, it's been such a journey, such a long road. And I do have a particular way of living, and I come by it from a history of addiction and recovery, really. So my first bad addiction was to drugs. I started using drugs when I was 14, and the drugs got worse and worse, and it all escalated. I started with psychedelics and pot and alcohol, experimenting. And then I found crystal meth when I was 16 and cocaine, and started freebasing cocaine when I was 17, and dropped out of high school and ended up prostitution, living not living on the streets, but not really having a place to live, that sort of in between place where you don't have a key to a place that you live. That's what my life was like. And I'm very grateful, super blessed that I got struck clean and sober when I was 20. And so I haven't had a drink or a drug in 28 years, which is the biggest miracle of my life. And then my addiction found another home very quickly, which was in food. And very quickly, I was living with clinical obesity. And I could tell that I was addicted to food because the way I was eating reminded me a lot of how I smoked crack. Like I was binging late into the night, eating, going out to smoke a cigarette, coming back in and eating, just nonstop. And I tried to apply the same recovery approach that had worked for me with drugs and alcohol to food, and it was not that easy at all. And so it really was a long journey with food, figuring out how to kick food when you still have to eat. You can't kick food. Like, it's the only substance, processed foods are truly addictive, but you can't stop eating all food. So you have to figure out where's the boundary, or now I call it the bright line. Where's the bright line between the foods you eat and the foods you don't eat? And so eventually I found a way of eating that allowed me to release all my excess weight. I went from obese to slender, and I've been in a US size 4 now for almost 20 years. Wow. In my personal right-sized body, I'm quite petite. And that goes along with a way of living that is tailored to keeping my stress in check so that I'm not needing to eat over life, right? Because life definitely gets lifey. And just, maybe the next question could be something around like, how did you go from crack addiction and prostitution to being a professor and, all that stuff? Because that's, it's was happening in parallel there as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to hear all about that, but I want to point out one nugget that you mentioned in passing, and it's something that's important for all of our listeners. When we have an addiction or a habit that is controlling our thinking and our behaviors, when we eliminate it, another one can crop up and find a home in your life, right? So it's important that we're aware of this, because it doesn't really matter what the addiction is, what the craving is, what the habit is. Your body will adapt and try and replace that if you don't do the real work that is necessary to break through what's underneath all of that junk that you're coming at it with. So
and it's psychological. It's psychological, but it's also physiological, right? Because that what you're speaking to is cross addiction, which is a real thing, and it speaks to the underlying neuroscience of addiction, which has to do with dopamine downregulation in the nucleus accumbens. So when we blow out our dopamine receptors by, drinking too much coffee, smoking too many cigarettes, watching too much pornography, eating too many donuts, smoking too much crack, whatever it is, we blow out our dopamine receptors, and then that dopamine downregulation feels like an itchiness, a restlessness, a dis-ease, like lack of comfort in our own skin. And that part of the brain is really okay accepting dopamine from any source. And that could be one clicking on Amazon. It could be just staying on our phones. And, you know, our phones now provide nonstop streams of dopamine. As a matter of fact, research shows that just this motion, this repetitive motion, tapping with our fingers produces a stream of dopamine. And then if you've got a little game you're playing that's giving you little rewards, well, you know, you'll just keep doing that over and over again. So it's really true. And so the healing work needs to be at the psychological level, but also just allowing those dopamine receptors to replenish, which they will. The dopamine receptors can come back to their normal functionality if you give them a rest a little bit.
Okay, so I got it. We've got to address this. How do you go from crack addict to professor?
Yeah, well, community college. Thank God for the community college system. I'm from California. I was born and raised in San Francisco. And when I got clean, my mom was going back to college at San Jose State, retraining for occupational therapy. And I moved back in with my mom when I was 20 years old. And I started going to San Jose City College. And I did great there and transferred to UC Berkeley. Crushed it there because I found cognitive science. So I found the study of the mind and the brain, which I'm so passionate about, and got 4.0s there, spoke at the graduation, and then wanted to keep studying. So I applied to PhD programs in the brain and cognitive sciences and got into every program I applied to and came out to the University of Rochester, which then and still has one of the top 3 programs in the world in that field. Got my master's and PhD, and then became a psychology professor, which I did for about 16 years. I did a 2-year postdoc in psychology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. So I got to live in Australia for a couple of years, which was wonderful. By that point, I was married. I got married in grad school, and my husband and I moved to Sydney. And when I came back to the States, I became a psychology professor. One of the things I ended up teaching, by that time, I had lost my excess weight, and I was passionate about healthy eating and the neuroscience of food addiction. And so I taught a college course on the psychology of eating and was helping people on a volunteer basis to lose their excess weight and recover from food addiction. And that's when in 2014, in my morning meditation, the universe put it in my heart and mind to write a book called Bright Line Eating. And that name, Bright Line Eating, was visited upon me in this really intense visualization in my morning meditation. And the name came, and I knew I had to write a book. And so I started an email list so that I could get a following, so I could get an agent, so I could get a publisher. And that book did get published in 2017, did become a New York Times bestseller like I had envisioned in my morning meditation. And now Bright Line Eating, helps people all over the world. Over 2 million people have joined that email list since I started it in 2014. And we help people lose their excess weight and really break free of food cravings and heal their brain.
That is crazy. Your story is just amazing. So for our listeners here, can you talk a little bit about Bright Line Eating and the neuroscience aspect? Because we're all about the neuroscience aspect here in this summit. So let's hear what you have to share with them.
Yeah. So what's happening with this obesity pandemic that, our collective weights just keep climbing and climbing and climbing. And we're doing such great work around body acceptance, around reducing prejudice and discrimination against obesity, something near and dear to my heart. Once you've lived with chronic obesity, you really understand society does not treat you the way it should. And all that's really important, but we also need to address the climbing weight. It's not good for any of us to have our average weight just keep going up and up and up and up. We haven't heard the statistics yet coming out of COVID, but I think the United States has already crossed 50% obesity.
Wow.
We've been at 70% overweight or obese for a long time. The last stats come out of 2018, 42.4% obesity, but it takes them a couple of years to get an official statistic. Anyway, so how the brain works when it comes to food, what's really driving this obesity pandemic is that processed foods rewire the brain. Processed foods rewire the brain. And they do that in two ways. I've already mentioned dopamine downregulation. That's what produces cravings. So some of us, not all of us, have a brain that is really sensitive, one might say vulnerable or susceptible to wiring to the cues that predict rewards. This is the dopamine system that tells us that something good is on the horizon, right? That anticipation of a reward. And when you have a brain that's smart like that, I mean, evolutionarily, it's a benefit to have a brain like that. But when you have a brain that wires that way, you're a sitting duck for developing addictions of all sorts. And 1/3 of people are highly susceptible, 1/3 are moderately susceptible, and 1/3 are just not susceptible. Their brains don't wire in that way at all. These are the people that can have a cup of coffee most mornings, but not every morning. They're the people that can have a cigarette at a concert and then not think about smoking a cigarette, until the next occasion presents itself. They certainly won't be like me going out and buying and smoking a pack that night, which is what I do if I have a cigarette at a concert. I'm a pack-a-day smoker instantly because my brain wires that way. So that's the first system. That's the craving system. The second way that the brain is rewiring has to do with this new weird phenomenon called insatiable hunger. This is hunger that's not regular hunger. Regular hunger is satiated when you eat. You get full and you stop wanting to eat. But these days, people are experiencing eating a full dinner and then sitting down to read or to watch TV or to scroll on their computer and wanting more food. Now, if they check their stomach, they're not hungry, but their brain wants to eat more. Their mouth wants to chew, their elbow wants to bend. And this is insatiable hunger. It's caused by leptin resistance. So leptin is the hormone that tells us we're full. Not only that, it's the hormone that tells us we want to move, to exercise. So the way leptin works is, let's picture 10,000 years ago, right? Where food was scarce and there were no grocery stores. But once in a blue moon, you'd kill a wildebeest and the berry bushes would be full and you'd sit around and gorge yourself and you'd gain a few pounds and your fat cells would get a little plumper. Well, fat cells release leptin. Leptin is the feedback mechanism that then comes back to the brain that says, you don't need to eat anymore, but now it's time to get active. Why don't you go build a hut? Why don't you go find a mate, right? Do something productive, all this energy.
Get up off the couch, you couch potato.
Exactly. Now, as long as your brain can see your leptin, you're in good shape. Now, we have plenty of leptin on board because we're getting plenty fat, but our brain isn't able to see it because it's being blocked. That's leptin resistance.
Okay.
And it's being blocked by high baseline insulin levels, high triglycerides, and high inflammation. And that's what blocks leptin in the brain. Now, it's all the processed foods that we're eating that are causing those conditions. So it's really sugar and flour. Sugar and flour is blocking leptin at the brain. Now, when you have leptin resistance, your brain literally physiologically believes you're starving. It will not let you stop eating. And so under these conditions, you can no more long-term calorie restrict than the man in the moon. Then you could no more do that than you could hold your breath and run up 15 flights of stairs. It's not a matter of willpower. Your brain is going to demand what it believes it needs to keep you alive. And so you've got to change how you're eating long term, which is hard in the face of leptin resistance and especially hard in the face of this current food environment that we're immersed in, where, snack foods are available everywhere you turn, essentially. So what it turns out is that in the face of this, for those people who have brains that are highly susceptible, right? That 1/3 that I was talking about that are highly susceptible, it turns out that a bright line for sugar and flour, a clear, unambiguous boundary that you just don't cross, a bright line, is the way to go. It turns out that it's easier to never eat a cookie than to try to eat one cookie. For those people, right? And that not becoming someone like a vegetarian doesn't eat meat, right? Becoming someone who doesn't eat sugar is the way to go for those people. It produces
Wow.
freedom, it produces clarity, it produces empowerment. And so a number of years ago, I became someone who doesn't eat sugar and flour. I'm not talking about not eating carbohydrates. I eat all whole, real fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, seeds. I eat all whole, real foods.
Yeah.
I just don't eat sugar and flour. I don't eat processed foods.
Okay.
And this also goes along with a way of living that you opened up our little conversation with, of meditating in the morning, staying connected to people throughout the day, having a gratitude practice, having a journaling practice at night, a lot of the things that are stress reducing and grounding and centering. That's what helps me stay on my bright lines. And I also eat 3 meals a day, not a lot of grazing and snacking in between, which more and more research is coming out that having a nice long fasting window between your last bite of food and your first bite of food is also very helpful. So I achieve that by only eating meals and not eating outside of mealtime. So that's how I live and how I
I
keep
love
to
it.
it.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. And it fits in with what I say all the time to my clients. Your brain will always find what it's looking for, right? So so
Yeah.
if you are looking to feed it, right, because you've got a little deficiency or an issue with the leptin in your brain, right? It's going to always look to solve that problem and find the solution, right? And I love what you're saying about the bright line eating. It's not really depriving yourself of any whole or real foods, but it is choosing, making choices about what is best for you and your body and your wellness and thriving. And processed foods, we all know, are not good for us, right?
Right.
And I think that many of us lean towards them because they're convenient, they're easy.
Yeah. And they're
So,
delicious.
yes. And so, as we think of these people who potentially work 12, 14-hour shifts,
Mhm.
how would you help them figure out how to maintain this bright line eating?
Yeah, totally, totally. And I work with people like that all the time.
Yeah.
It's so doable. It's so doable, but I won't lie, it does take some planning and preparation,
Yeah.
right? This isn't the kind of thing that you just wake up in the morning and walk into work having no idea what you're going to eat that day and succeed, right? This is where that old adage, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, kind of comes in, right? But let me point out the brilliance of adopting a structured plan of eating under circumstances like that, right? When you have a structured plan of eating, it makes it really easy to plan, because you kind of have a food plan of categories and quantities of food. You know how many pieces of fruit you're going to need. You know how much protein you're going to need. You know how many servings of vegetables you're going to need. And you can throw together your meal and rush out the door in about 2 minutes. It really becomes easy once you streamline it and automate it, right? It's sort of like how brushing your teeth twice a day is really easy. If your dentist said you had to brush and floss 6 times a day, that would become very hard, right? So
Yes.
breakfast, lunch, and dinner, once you know kind of the structure of what you're going to eat for breakfast, the structure of what you're going to eat for lunch, and the structure of what you're going to eat for dinner, it becomes very, very easy. Now, grab and go foods are very helpful for someone who's going to be working a 12-hour shift. Fruit is super easy, grab and go, bananas, apples, oranges. Oh my gosh, you can't get much easier than that. Protein options that are super helpful are little baggies of nuts, those mozzarella string cheese servings. If you eat cheese, that is super easy and super helpful. And they're already pre-portioned out. They're 1 ounce exactly. So that's easy. If you're lighter and smaller, 2 of those would be a serving. If you're a bigger person, then 3 of those would be a serving.
Okay.
And these days, most grocery stores have a lot of prepared vegetable options, right? Like baby carrots, for example, or, baggies of celery or broccoli or
Mhm.
whatever. So I just recommend, throw together some vegetables, And yeah, so things like, hard boil a bunch of eggs. If you like eggs, hard
Mm.
boil a dozen eggs, and then you have 2 or 3 eggs to grab and go for the day. Yeah, so that's kind of the style of eating that I recommend. I also personally tend to make my lunch out of what I ate for dinner the night before. I tend to
Yeah.
make, leftovers. I put them into a container and bring them the next day for lunch, add an apple, good to go. So yeah, it takes a little bit of planning. The Bright Line Eating food plan, of course, creates exactly the structure, but that gives you a fair idea of my general approach.
So I love what you're saying, because we all know that meal prep really sets us up for success.
Yeah.
If we could meal prep even on a Sunday or a Saturday and take the day and just cook a bunch of grilled chicken or something to be ready
Yeah.
for the week, cook trays of vegetables, and
Yep.
have everything all prepared for ourselves, it makes it easy. And what I'm also noticing you say is that doing life this way really cuts back on that decision fatigue that you're all facing, with
That's
so many decisions that you have to make all day long. Eating is not something you have to think about then, because it's already been thought about, right? So it just simplifies your life. So what I'm hearing you say is that that takes a huge chunk of stress right out of the picture for you.
That's so right, Doreen. You took the words right out of my mouth. It's
Yeah.
brilliant. It's so, so true. One study showed that the average person these days is making 211 food related decisions every day. It's exhausting.
Yes.
And yeah, if you walk out of the house and you don't have a plan already for what you're going to eat, first of all, you're not going to end up eating that healthfully, because the brain is a high density calorie seeking machine, especially if you haven't slept enough. But even under normal circumstances, the brain knows, even if you don't know how many calories is in this versus that, the brain knows, and it's going to pick, the junkiest, most processed, highest calorie density thing. That's its job. It's trying to keep you alive. And that's what where it thinks the bang for the buck is, right? And so, yeah, if you don't have those decisions to make, if you already know what you're eating, if when that pause of break time at work comes, you've got your little, lunch toad, and you just know exactly what you're going to eat. It's so much more stress-free, and you don't have to take the time to go forage for food, right?
Exactly.
You don't need the cafeteria, you don't need the vending machine. You've got your food right there. You can just sit and breathe, take a moment, socialize, eat your meal. Yeah, it's the way to live.
So for me, that is like the worst thing, deciding what we're having for dinner. I always know it's going to be protein and vegetables of some kind, right? So that part is settled, but just making the decisions on how to prepare it becomes like, I say to my family, I just don't want to decide, just pick what you want, right?
Yeah.
Because, but if I meal prepped on the weekend, all of that would just be cut right
Yeah.
out of the picture, cut right
Yeah,
out.
or another option would be have a schedule,
Yeah.
Monday is, grilled chicken and peppers and onions, and Tuesday is, whatever your family likes to eat, right? I know
Yeah.
some people are plant-based, which is great, grilled
Yeah.
tempeh and ratatouille or whatever, but yes, I'm a big fan of Food Factory on the weekends as well. I personally don't do Food Factory. A lot of the people who do Bright Line Eating do. But I just cook through the week at dinner time, but I just make a lot extra. And so then I have
Yeah.
spillover protein and vegetables for the next, 2 or 3 lunches.
Sure. And so for those who are working shifts and they work maybe 3 12-hour shifts, that might be a good formula for you, right?
Mhm.
Cooking during the night, making extra,
Yeah.
so that your family could have a fresh hot meal prepared. They get to smell the whole thing. They get the whole experience at dinner time as you eat as a family, and then you're making extra for your food.
Yeah.
So
Right.
here's a problem that I see a lot with medical professionals, teachers, well-meaning patients and parents send cookies And
Yeah. They do.
they send cookies and cookies and cookies. And on the counters of nursing stations across the world are trays of cookies just staring at us.
Yeah.
How do we resist?
Well, this is where a bright line is the lifesaver, right?
Mm,
Because if you are still aiming for moderation, if you're still falling for that old, well, you couldn't never eat sugar again, right? And it's like, you can't eliminate all food groups because that results in eating disorders. And it's like, since when did sugar become a food group? Far off the beaten path have we gone?
yeah.
So when you have a bright line where you're literally someone who doesn't eat sugar or flour,
Mm.
you're not going to eat that. You made that decision a long time ago, right? That's not your food. And so it becomes just like they've sent in peanut butter cookies and you're allergic to peanut butter. It's like, it doesn't, or you're allergic to peanuts. It's like, it doesn't matter that there's cookies there. It's not your food. You're not going to be eating that.
Yes.
And so when you make that decision firmly and you stick with it for a bit, what happens is the urge to eat those foods literally goes away. It's called extinction. And it's a phenomenon in the brain where you can make an urge or an inclination literally fizzle away to almost nothing. Not literally nothing, like you'll still have a, are you sure? Kind of thought in your brain. But as long as you say, yep, I'm sure, coming from a place of identity, again, like a vegetarian doesn't eat meat. When you come from that core of identity, then it becomes actually really easy. And as long as you're not giving in intermittently, that creates intermittent reinforcement, which creates a brain that's literally resistant to extinction. You will always have a brain that's saying, how about now? How about now? How about now? And you don't want that. So don't give in even a little bit for quite a stretch. And suddenly you have a brain that's completely peaceful. It's amazing.
Well, I love what you're saying because that how about now syndrome has occurred to me when I was trying to stop drinking several times over the last few decades, right? I'd say, I'm not going to drink during the week, right? And I'm going to just drink on the weekends. But always the brain is like, go ahead, you deserve one right now. Go ahead, right? The brain is always there to help prod you to cross that line, as you're saying. So what was easy for me was when I stopped drinking and I made that decision, just like you said, based on my values. I'm not the kind of person that drinks alcohol because it's not helping me get where I want to be. It's not helping me be the best for my family. So I created all of these thoughts around who I wanted to be and how I wanted to show up in the world. And what I noticed that was that alcohol was not helping me achieve those things at all. Actually, it was just stopping me. And every time my brain was struggling and fighting with itself, I called it like this internal battle that was going on. It was draining my energy. It was making me unhappy. It was increasing my stress. And that wasn't healthy either. So for me, I get what you're saying about like making that bright line and choosing to stop a specific pattern or behavior, because seriously, it takes all of the guesswork and all the drama out of the brain.
That's
for
right.
me.
That's right. And now are you free?
I am. Yeah. I've been for 2 years. I haven't drank alcohol. And not because I'm not, thank you, not because I'm not surrounded by people who are drinking, not because I judge it as bad. There's none of that, right? I wasn't an alcoholic, but I just didn't like the way my relationship was with the alcohol. I felt like there was this relationship that was making me only want to be involved in activities that included alcohol. And if the activity didn't include alcohol, I really wasn't as interested, right? So I started noticing these things about my patterns of behavior. And I said, this isn't right. If I need alcohol to be happy, if I say I need alcohol to be happy, this is not healthy. This is not healthy for me. I'm going to change this relationship. And it's the same with food, as you're saying, right?
Yeah.
we can have an unhealthy relationship with certain foods that we're eating. And we get to choose and take control of our lives by applying a bright line principle
Yeah,
to
that's right.
your life. Yeah.
That's right. So here's what happens when people apply this bright line technique
Yeah.
around sugar and flour to their eating. So
Yeah.
people who've gone through our program, just in 8 weeks, here's what happens.
Yeah.
Their peace and serenity with food goes up. So even though they're adopting a very structured way of eating, they become way more peaceful around their eating. Their hunger and their cravings go down, steadily down, almost linearly down to little or no hunger or cravings anymore. And they lose an enormous amount of weight. So you've probably heard of Noom, Weight Watchers, Jenny
Yes.
Craig.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
3 to 4 times more weight than people lose in those
Wow.
programs. And that weight loss is maintained. It's not gained back. So they continue to lose weight up to a year, and then they maintain that weight loss. We're doing a study now to look at 6-year outcomes. But we published our 2-year results, and there was 0 weight regain out to 2 years, which other studies don't show. And here's the most amazing thing. We looked at over 4,000 people, at every age who did our program, and there was no difference in weight loss among people from their 20s and 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. They were all losing weight equivalently. Now, we all know that it's harder to lose weight when you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but not when you do bright line eating. And the reason is that what makes it harder to lose weight later in life is that you don't have estrogen supporting your insulin. So men have estrogen too. Estrogens are a class of hormones. And in both women and men from the 50s and on, estrogen tanks. It goes very, very low. So estrogen supports your insulin. And if you're going to be eating sugar and flour, you need that support, because that's the fat storage and fat release hormone that keeps your blood sugar in balance. But if you're not eating sugar and flour, you don't need that support, because you're not messing with your blood sugar all the time with processed foods. And so eliminating sugar and flour literally levels the playing field and allows people who are postmenopausal or later in life, in their last 2-3 decades of life, to be losing weight literally as if they're 20 or 30 years old again. So yeah, it's remarkable.
Sign me up, coach. Yeah, I love it. Oh, wow. This has been amazing.